Story number 1.
It had been a long week for Lacey. The kind of week where every day blended into the next with work, late hours, and a constant feeling of being stretched thin. By Friday evening, all she wanted was to unwind in the comfort of her apartment, maybe watch a movie, and forget about everything for a few hours. She locked the door behind her with a sigh of relief. The familiar, slightly musty scent of her apartment greeted her, offering a small sense of comfort after a day that seemed to drag on forever. The city outside was quiet, and the streetlights bathed the room in a soft yellow glow. She placed her bag down and kicked off her shoes, then made her way to the kitchen. The fridge hummed in the background as she pulled out a bottle of wine, the only thing that seemed to help her relax. A few sips into her drink, Lacey found herself zoning out, staring at the blank TV screen in front of her. The day's stress slowly began to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of the city and the rhythmic sound of her breathing. She felt safe here, her apartment, her space. It had always been her refuge. But then, the knock came. It was soft at first, almost like a tap, barely audible above the sound of her TV. Lacey frowned, glancing at the door. Who could it be at this hour? She wasn't expecting anyone, and the building's hallways were usually empty at night. She stood up, her wine glass still in her hand, and moved cautiously toward the door. As she reached the peephole, she saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty, dimly lit, and silent. Another knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. Lacey's pulse quickened, her hand still gripping the doorknob. She had never been one to jump at every strange noise, but there was something unsettling about this. She hesitated. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but the thought of someone standing outside, waiting, gnawed at her. Maybe it was a neighbor who needed something. Maybe it was the delivery guy who'd forgotten his keys, but she didn't recognize the sound of their footsteps or the rhythm of the knock. She took a deep breath and called out, trying to sound confident. "Hello?" There was no reply, just silence. Her heart skipped a beat. There was no reason for anyone to be so quiet, especially if they were knocking at her door. Something felt off. She turned the deadbolt, her hand shaking ever so slightly, and cracked the door open just a few inches. The cool air from the hallway rushed in, and she squinted into the darkness. Nothing. There was no one standing there, just the empty hallway stretching out before her. Lacey felt a wave of relief, but it didn't last long. The faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air, even though she knew there was no one nearby who smoked. It was old, stale, like it had been trapped in the walls for years. She frowned, her nerves returning. The hallway was too still. With a shrug, she closed the door and bolted it shut again. Probably just a prank, she told herself. Maybe someone had knocked by mistake. She returned to the couch, trying to push the uneasy feeling aside. But then, it happened again. The knock, louder this time. Lacey's breath hitched, her grip tightening on the wine glass. She set it down on the coffee table and stood up, this time more cautiously. There was no denying it now. The knocking was coming from outside her door, and it wasn't stopping. She moved to the door again, heart pounding. This time, she didn't even bother with the peephole. She opened it slightly, peeking out into the dimly lit hallway. No one. Her hands were now clammy, her stomach tight with dread. She felt a sudden impulse to close the door quickly and ignore it, but she couldn't. Something was wrong. She stepped out into the hallway, her footsteps barely audible against the worn carpet. The hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with closed apartment doors. It was deserted. Lacey looked both ways, her breath quickening. She called out again, but there was no response. A soft, almost inaudible whisper brushed against her ear. "Don't leave." Lacey whipped her head around, her pulse roaring in her ears. There was no one behind her, nothing but the empty hallway. She felt a chill settle over her, creeping up her spine. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She backed into her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her hands shook as she locked it again, the weight of the moment sinking in. Something wasn't right. For the next few hours, Lacey couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She sat on her couch, staring at the door, her eyes darting to the windows, the kitchen, any corner of the apartment that might hold a clue to the strange events unfolding around her. The knock had been one thing, but the whisper felt like something else entirely. She pulled the covers up over her, trying to sleep, but the sensation of eyes on her wouldn't go away. She turned the TV on to drown out the silence, but it only made her feel more unsettled. The low hum of the static felt oppressive, like a constant reminder of how alone she really was. Just as she was about to doze off, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Lacey jolted awake, reaching for it with trembling hands. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Let me in, Lacey." Her blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she stared at the screen. She had no idea who this person was, but the message sent a wave of terror crashing over her. How could they know her name? Why were they sending this now? She typed a reply, her fingers unsteady. "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "You know me." Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat there, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it all. There was no way this could be real. It had to be a joke, a prank from a friend or someone who knew how to mess with her. But everything in her gut screamed that something was terribly wrong. She tossed her phone aside, her eyes darting to the window. The street outside was empty, the lights casting long shadows on the pavement. Nothing seemed out of place. But that feeling, the feeling that she wasn't alone, was growing stronger. Lacey had never been the type to be easily spooked, but tonight felt different. The air in the apartment seemed thicker, more oppressive. She couldn't escape the gnawing sense that someone or something was waiting. Her phone buzzed again. She grabbed it, her heart hammering. "Open the door, Lacey. I'm right outside." Her stomach churned, nausea spreading through her body. She backed away from the door, not daring to open it, but the terror gnawed at her from the inside. She couldn't stay here. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. She needed to leave. With trembling hands, Lacey grabbed her coat and bag, her mind racing with possibilities. She had to go somewhere. Anywhere. She couldn't stay in this apartment, but as she reached for the door handle, she froze. The whisper came again. "Don't leave." Lacey's breath caught in her throat. The voice sounded closer now, almost as if it was right behind her. Without thinking, she turned, bolting for the window and flinging it open. The cool night air rushed in, but it didn't bring any relief. She glanced down. The drop was too far to jump. She wasn't thinking clearly. She needed to escape, but there was no way out. Then, in the reflection of the window, she saw it. A shadow moving just behind her. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally still. It had no face, just a silhouette against the dim light of the apartment. Lacey spun around, but there was no one there. She screamed. Her mind was reeling, spinning into panic as she backed into the corner, the room closing in around her. Her eyes were wild as she searched every corner of the apartment. She was trapped, unable to escape, and there was something in here with her. Something waiting. The silence of the apartment seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by her ragged breathing and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of something shifting in the dark. And then, the knocking began again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I've lived in the same apartment for 3 years. It's nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom place in a quiet building that's a little too old and a little too cheap for the area. But it's mine, and after a couple of years of moving around, I was happy to have settled into a routine. The nights were mostly uneventful, just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rattle of the radiator keeping me company. It was my sanctuary after long days working at the local bookstore. But then things started to change. Slowly at first. Little things I tried to explain away, like objects moved from where I'd left them or strange sounds that I thought were just the building settling. I wasn't the paranoid type, but after a while it felt like I was constantly on edge. And it wasn't just during the day. It was at night, when I should have been the most relaxed, that it became impossible to ignore. It started with the footsteps. I'd be sitting on my couch, watching TV or reading a book, and then I'd hear them. Light, almost imperceptible footsteps coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the building's creaking floors. Old buildings do that, right? But they kept happening night after night. At first, it was easy to dismiss. I told myself it was just the tenants upstairs. But as time went on, the footsteps seemed to be getting closer, following me. Always from behind, always just a little out of view. The first time I truly got freaked out was on a Thursday night. I had just finished a long shift, at the bookstore and was exhausted, ready to crawl into bed and forget about the world for a few hours. I shut off the lights in the living room and made my way to the bedroom. As I was about to pull back the covers, I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they were louder, closer, and they were coming from my living room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My apartment was small, so there was nowhere for someone to hide. I took a deep breath and pushed the bedroom door open slowly, holding my breath as I peeked into the hallway. There was no one there. Nothing had changed. Just the same dim light from the street lamps outside shining through the cracks in the blinds. I figured I was just being paranoid and shook it off. Maybe the floors had just shifted. Maybe it was the wind pushing against the window. But even after I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The quiet stillness of the room felt oppressive. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a soft knock on the door. It wasn't like any knock I'd ever heard before. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was waiting for me to answer. I lay there in my bed, my breath caught in my throat, not knowing what to do. Should I check? Should I just pretend I didn't hear it? My mind raced. I was alone, I was certain of that. No one else lived in my building, just me and a few elderly neighbors who kept to themselves. I had no reason to believe someone would be knocking at this hour. Another knock, more insistent this time, came from the door. I slowly got up, my legs shaking, and walked towards the living room. I reached for the doorknob, but as my hand touched it, the knock came again. But this time, the sound was different. It wasn't just a knock, it sounded like a tap, 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 4 quick taps, almost as if someone was trying to get my attention. I backed away from the door, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to open the door. Something felt wrong. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But before I could even get a word out, the line went dead. I checked the phone. No signal. Nothing. My apartment's on the 3rd floor, so I knew there was no reason for the signal to cut out like that. I had a strong connection all the time, but now there was nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the hairs in my arms tingle. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. The knocking had stopped, but the air felt thick with tension. I waited, hoping the person on the other side of the door would go away, but they didn't. It was as if they were waiting for me to make the first move. I cautiously approached the door, my hand hovering just above the handle. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and my breath was shallow. I didn't know what I was expecting. Who could be standing outside at this time of night? I didn't have any friends, no one who'd come over at this hour. Another knock, 4 taps. I turned the handle slowly and opened the door a crack. The hallway outside was empty. I stepped out into the hallway, looking both ways, but there was no one. I stood there for a few moments, feeling ridiculous. I was standing there in my pajamas, barefoot, with a pounding heart and the sensation that I was being watched. I should have gone back inside, locked the door, and gone back to bed. But I didn't. Something urged me to keep moving. The hallway was eerily quiet, and I thought I could hear a faint sound, like someone breathing softly. I pressed my back to the wall, my feet barely making a sound as I crept down the hallway towards the stairwell. The sound of breathing grew louder, and I could feel the air get heavier with each step. It was as if something or someone was right behind me, following me. I turned the corner to the stairwell and stopped dead in my tracks. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of light flickering from the crack. The hairs on my neck stood up. The basement. I never went down there. It was an old, musty place with no real reason to visit. But that light, it shouldn't have been on. The tenants didn't use it, and I didn't know anyone who had keys. I felt the urge to call out, but my voice was caught in my throat. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't look away from the basement door. It was like something was pulling me toward it, something dark and cold. The door creaked as if it was slowly swinging open, but I didn't wait to see what was on the other side. I turned and ran back down the hall, back to my apartment, and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands were trembling as I locked every bolt, chain, and latch. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and paranoia. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every noise in the building made me jump. Every creak, every whisper had me on edge. I stayed curled up on the couch, phone in hand, ready to dial 911 if I needed to. But by morning, everything seemed to calm down. The sunlight came through the blinds, and the world seemed just as normal as it had been the day before. But I knew something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the building with me, someone who didn't belong. I'd lived here for years, and I'd never felt that way before. The rest of the week was the same. I tried to go back to my routine, but the strange knocks, the flickering basement light, the sensation of being followed, it all became a constant presence, hovering just beneath the surface. I tried asking my neighbors about it, but no one seemed to know anything. The old woman across the hall told me she hadn't heard anything unusual. The man who lived above me hadn't noticed anything strange. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few weeks later, I went back to the basement door. I don't know why, but something inside me told me I had to know what was on the other side. The door was ajar again, and this time, I couldn't stop myself. I pushed it open and stepped into the darkness. The light was on, flickering as it always did, casting strange shadows on the walls. I walked forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell of mildew and old wood filled my nose. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I couldn't stop myself from going deeper into the basement. And then I saw it. There, in the far corner of the room, was a small wooden chest. I had never seen it before. I walked over to it, my curiosity overwhelming my fear. I opened it. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed and worn with age. But they weren't just any photos. They were of me, of my apartment, of me walking down the street, of me in my own living room. The images were taken at odd angles, like someone had been watching me for a long time. I stumbled back, the chest falling to the floor with a loud thud. My mind was racing. Who had been watching me? Who had taken these photos, and how long had they been in my apartment? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe. Whoever had been following me, whoever had been watching, was still out there, and they weren't done. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The cabin was supposed to be the perfect escape. I had been working too much, stressed from a never-ending cycle of emails, meetings, and city life. When I found an old listing for a secluded cabin in the woods, I thought it would be a great opportunity to disconnect. The cabin was only a few hours' drive away from where I lived, nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization. I imagined spending the weekend hiking, reading by the fireplace, and enjoying the peace of nature. It was a plan that seemed perfect for unwinding. I arrived just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The roads were narrow, the trees growing thick on either side, their branches casting long, eerie shadows across the winding road. The cabin was just as described in the listing, small and cozy, made of rough-hewn wood with a stone chimney curling up toward the sky. It was exactly what I needed, simple and quiet. After a few trips unloading my car, I managed to get everything inside. I lit a fire in the fireplace and set about making a quick dinner. Nothing fancy, just something to fill the stomach after a long drive. As the sun disappeared and darkness enveloped the forest outside, I opened a bottle of wine and relaxed, watching the flames dance in the hearth. The air inside the cabin felt warm, a pleasant contrast to the crisp chill outside. The first few hours passed without incident. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the trees, and the occasional branches scratching against the cabin made the entire place feel a bit more isolated. But that was part of the charm. I loved the feeling of being away from it all, even if it did come with an eerie stillness that could be unnerving at times. I pushed that unease aside and settled into my evening, reading a book I'd brought along, only half paying attention to the pages as my mind wandered. It was around 11 p.m. when I first heard it, the sound of something outside. At first, I couldn't quite place it. It wasn't an animal. The noise was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I paused, setting my book down, and listened harder. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, but it came from the porch just outside the door. I tried to brush it off as wind or something scraping against the wood, but the sound persisted, more frequent now. I stood up cautiously, walking toward the door to investigate. The wind had picked up considerably, and the sound of the rain against the roof drowned out almost everything else. I hesitated, my hand resting on the door handle, unsure of whether to open it. Something told me I shouldn't, but I dismissed the thought as paranoia. I slowly cracked the door open, my eyes scanning the dimly lit porch through the small gap. Nothing. The darkness beyond the porch was impenetrable, only the pale light from the cabin's window spilling out onto the wooden steps. There was no movement, no sign of life. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the steady sound of rain. Relieved, I shut the door and locked it, telling myself I was just being overly cautious. I went back to my chair and resumed reading, though my mind kept returning to the sound I'd heard. It wasn't quite right. I dismissed it again, trying to focus on the book, but every few minutes, my attention kept drifting back to the door, as though I were expecting something to happen. Then, around midnight, the knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent, tap, 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 followed by a pause, and then tap, tap, tap again. My stomach twisted into knots, and a cold shiver ran up my spine. I stood up abruptly, heart racing, and looked toward the door. The noise was so deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on, and approached the door. I was no longer thinking rationally. My mind was in overdrive, imagining all kinds of explanations for the noise. Wild animals, someone lost in the woods, a prank. But none of it felt right. There was an odd weight to the air, a stillness that I couldn't shake. It felt like I was being watched. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled open the door just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The light flickered, casting long shadows across the porch and the steps leading into the dark woods beyond. The knocking had stopped again. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I thought I might have imagined it. But then, there, in the corner of the porch near the edge of the railing, was a figure, a man, standing absolutely still, facing toward me. His posture was unnaturally rigid, like he was frozen in place. His clothes were drenched, rain clinging to his dark jacket and pants, but there was no sign of movement. I couldn't make out his face in the dim light, but I could see that his head was slightly tilted as if he were studying me, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest. The first thought that crossed my mind was that I should close the door and lock it again. But something kept me rooted in place. I couldn't look away from him. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice shaky but louder than I intended. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring. The silence between us stretched on, and the air around me felt heavier, thicker. Every instinct in me screamed to shut the door to get away from this strange encounter, but I couldn't seem to move. Suddenly, he took a slow step forward. That broke whatever control I had left. My mind screamed to close the door, and I did so with a force I hadn't realized I could muster. I locked it quickly, my hands trembling as I slid the deadbolt into place. My breath was shallow, panicked, and I backed away from the door, my back hitting the wall. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what was happening. I stood there for a long time, listening for any sound. The man was gone, and the knocking had stopped, but the weight of the encounter lingered. Had I imagined it? Was I just being paranoid? No. That man had been real. He had been standing right there, watching me. I tried to calm myself, sitting down on the couch, trying to regain some sense of control. But the fear kept gnawing at me, and no matter how many times I told myself it was just some random person passing through, something deep inside me didn't believe it. My thoughts kept racing back to that moment. His stillness, the way he had just stood there in the rain. I sat in the dim light for what felt like hours, listening to the rain fall outside, the wind whistling through the trees. The whole place felt too quiet, too still. It was like the world had just stopped, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I had been up for hours, and the adrenaline had drained me. I decided to try and sleep, even though the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I locked the bedroom door behind me and crawled into bed, hoping that I could at least get some rest. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump, my heart racing with anxiety. I kept telling myself that everything was fine, that I was overreacting, that it was just some man out there, lost, or maybe someone who had been wandering the woods. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Then, just before dawn, I heard the softest of sounds, a scraping at the window. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I could hear it clearly. Scrape, scrape, scrape. My heart stopped in my chest. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate. I couldn't make myself move. I couldn't do anything but listen. Scrape, 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 and then, just like before, the silence returned. I never went back to that cabin. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The air was still and thick with humidity as Lily sat in her living room, glancing nervously at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. The neighborhood was usually quiet at this time of night, but tonight felt different. It was a Saturday, and though she hadn't planned on going out, she hadn't expected the kind of solitude she was now facing. She'd just finished a late shift at the hospital. Exhausted from the long hours, she had only one goal in mind: to get some sleep. She was used to late hours and strange shifts, but tonight the usual comfort of her small apartment felt stifling. The house was old, drafty, full of creaks, with floors that never quite seemed to settle. The wind outside howled, causing the thin curtains on her living room window to flutter occasionally. Lily glanced toward the window. It was the kind of night that made you feel the weight of every sound, every rustle of leaves or creak in the walls. And though she was no stranger to the noises of her home, tonight they felt different, almost deliberate. She was alone, and though she'd never been afraid of being by herself, there was something unnerving about the isolation that night. Her phone buzzed, dragging her from her thoughts. A text from her sister. "Hey, just checking in. You good?" Lily quickly typed back, forcing herself to sound upbeat. "Yeah, all good. Just finished work, heading to bed soon." It wasn't unusual for her sister to check in, especially when Lily worked nights. They were close, and Lily always appreciated the concern. She put her phone down the coffee table and stretched, trying to shake off the unease that was slowly creeping up her spine. But then, a sound from the kitchen caught her attention. A faint, scuffling noise, like something scraping against the floor. Lily froze. Her first instinct was to dismiss it, assuming it was just the house settling. After all, the old wood floors had a tendency to make strange noises, especially in the middle of the night. But then the sound came again, louder this time, and closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She stood up from the couch, her pulse quickening. It wasn't just the floor creaking this time. It was a scratching sound. Deliberate, almost as if something, or someone, was moving across the floor. Lily's first thought was to check the door. Was it possible she had left it unlocked? She knew she hadn't, but the paranoia was gnawing at her. She grabbed the phone again and quickly texted her sister, just to reassure herself. "Hey, everything okay? I think I heard something." Before she could press send, the scratching noise came again. Louder, more pronounced. Her heart skipped a beat. The sound was definitely coming from the kitchen. It was a small space, not far from the living room, and she was certain she was the only one there. She hadn't heard the front door open, hadn't seen anyone enter, but the sound, now unmistakably louder, made her stomach churn with unease. Lily's body felt frozen. She had a choice. She could investigate, or she could pretend it wasn't happening and hope it went away. But the curiosity that clawed at her was stronger than her fear. She needed to know what was making that sound. Cautiously, she walked toward the kitchen, trying to make her footsteps as quiet as possible. The floor creaked under her weight as she moved, and she held her breath as she peered into the dimly lit room. The light above the sink flickered sporadically, casting erratic shadows across the countertops. Everything was still. The sound had stopped. Her chest tightened with the sudden silence. Maybe it was the wind, she whispered to herself, more to reassure herself than anything. The storm had picked up outside, the wind howling against the windows, so it made sense that something could have shifted. But as she turned to head back to the living room, her eyes were drawn to the small wooden chair in the corner of the kitchen. It was facing her. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The chair had never been positioned that way before. It had always been turned slightly, facing the wall, as if to be out of the way. But now it was facing directly toward her, and the movement of it made her stomach lurch. There was no way it could have moved on its own. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. She slowly took a step forward, heart pounding in her chest. The wind outside howled louder, pressing against the windows as if trying to push its way inside. She reached the chair and turned it back around, her hands trembling. As she did, she noticed something on the floor beneath it, a small, crumpled note. Lily's blood ran cold as she leaned down to pick it up. The note was simple, written in a hurried, jagged scrawl. "I'm here." Her hand trembled as she stared at the note, the words burning into her mind. She didn't know what to think. There was no logical explanation for it. She hadn't heard anyone enter the apartment, hadn't seen anyone. But the note was there. A noise from the hallway snapped her out of her thoughts, and she jerked her head toward the sound. A door creaked. Lily's heart raced, and before she could process the panic bubbling in her chest, she heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving toward her. She didn't know what to do. Should she call the police? Should she hide? But the thought of someone being inside her apartment, of someone moving around in the dark, paralyzed her. The footsteps grew louder. Lily's mind screamed at her to run, to get out of there, but her body didn't obey. She was rooted to the spot. Then, the voice came. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Don't be scared." Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward the hallway, her eyes searching the dark space. She couldn't see anyone, but the voice continued. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed toward the kitchen, her eyes never leaving the hallway. Her phone was still in her hand, but her fingers felt numb as she clutched it. She couldn't think straight. The voice came again, this time a little louder, as though it was right behind her. "I just wanted to say hello." Lily spun around, eyes wild, but the room was empty. The sound of the storm outside filled the silence, but there was nothing else. No footsteps, no voice. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. That's when she saw it. A figure in the doorway. It was tall, slender, and shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, but there was something about its presence, something that made her blood run cold. For a moment, neither of them moved. Lily's breath hitched in her throat as she slowly backed away, her legs shaky beneath her. The figure didn't advance, but it didn't leave either. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Lily stood frozen, not sure if she was still dreaming, if her mind had finally snapped under the pressure of the storm, or if something more sinister was happening. The silence that followed felt like it was choking her. She couldn't bring herself to look away from the doorway, her body tense and waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. The house was still again. Her phone buzzed and her heart leapt in her chest. A text from her sister. "Lily, please answer me. Are you okay?" Lily quickly texted back, her hands shaking as she typed, "I need help. Someone's in my apartment. I'm scared." But when she hit send, the lights flickered once more. The door creaked open again, and the voice, cold and calm, whispered from the darkness, "Too late." Story the end.
Story number 5.
The storm came without warning. 1 minute the evening was calm, with only a slight breeze rustling the trees outside, and then, within minutes, the sky had darkened and the rain came pouring down in sheets. The winds howled through the trees, and the sound of thunder shook the house. Emma sighed, pulling her blanket tighter around her as she sat in the living room, curled up with a book. The house was quiet, too quiet. She lived alone in an old, 2-story house on the outskirts of town. It was a little isolated, sure, but she liked it that way. It gave her the peace and quiet she craved after a long week at work. The house had a certain charm, with its creaky floors, antique furniture, and warm, cozy atmosphere. Still, every so often, the house felt too empty. The silence, though peaceful at first, could sometimes feel oppressive, especially at night when the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls. Emma had lived there for almost 2 years now, but every time a storm rolled in, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't quite alone. The thought made her feel silly. It was just the wind, she told herself, just the house settling. But still there was something about the darkness outside, the way the storm made the house feel like it was caving in on her, that always set her on edge. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. A text from her best friend, Mia. "Hey, I know you're probably trying to relax, but are you okay? You haven't posted anything on social media today, and with this storm, just wanted to make sure you're all right." Emma smiled, shaking her head. Mia was always so worried. Emma quickly typed a response. "I'm good, just reading and listening to the storm. It's pretty bad outside, but I'm fine." Thanks for checking in, though. She pressed send, putting her phone down. The lights flickered. She didn't think much of it. It was probably just the storm causing some trouble with the power. She continued reading, but the sound of the rain pounding against the windows grew louder, and she couldn't help but glance up occasionally to check if the lights would flicker again. Then she heard it. A sound. A thump. It came from upstairs. Emma froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, straining her ears. Another thump, louder this time. It came from the second floor, just above her. Her stomach twisted in knots. The house was old. Settling noises were normal. She tried to brush it off as the wind or the storm making the house creak. But the sound continued. Thump, thump, thump. Her pulse quickened. She placed the book down on the coffee table and stood up, her eyes scanning the darkened room. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it was holding its breath. The thumps grew more frequent, and then, without warning, there was a loud bang. Emma jumped, her heart hammering in her chest. She rushed to the window, pulling the curtains back to see if the storm had worsened, if something had caused the noise. But the rain was still coming down in sheets, the wind howling through the trees. There was nothing unusual outside. Her phone buzzed again. Just checking in. Are you sure you're okay? I'm really worried about you with this weather. If you're feeling creeped out, I could come over. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she read the message. Mia's concern was sweet, but it only made Emma feel more uneasy. She typed back quickly. I'm fine, just the storm. It's really loud. But thanks for checking in. I'll be okay. She tried to ignore the thumps coming from above, but the sound only grew louder, more deliberate. Thump, 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 thump. The house was old, but it wasn't that old. It shouldn't be making noises like this. She turned off the lights and moved toward the stairs, her breathing shallow. Her feet felt heavy as she moved toward the hallway where the stairs to the second floor awaited. Her hand trembled as she reached for the banister. Thump, thump, thump. The noise was coming from the attic. Her heart was racing now, and her throat was dry. The attic door was at the top of the stairs, hidden behind a small wooden door. She never went up there. There was no reason to. It had been locked when she first moved in, and she hadn't bothered to open it. Who knew what was up there, or what the previous owners had left behind? Another bang from the attic. Emma stepped back, her pulse racing. What was going on? Was someone in the attic? Was someone in the house? She grabbed her phone again, but before she could send a message, she heard a low sound, a creak coming from the top of the stairs. Something was moving up there. Her blood ran cold. She didn't know what to do. Her instincts told her to run, to leave the house, to get out of there and call the police. But her feet felt glued to the floor. Thump. The sound was right above her, just beyond the attic door. She could hear something breathing now. Slow, deliberate breaths, as though whatever it was up there was waiting for her to make a move. Her hands shook as she reached for the door handle to the attic. The metal was cold to the touch, but it didn't matter. Her entire body was numb. The house felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing in with every passing second. She had to know what it was. The attic door creaked as she opened it, revealing the steep staircase leading into the dark. The light from the hallway barely illuminated the stairs, casting long shadows on the walls. Thump. The noise was louder now, just above her head. Emma forced herself to take the first step up, then another. Her hands were slick with sweat as she clutched the banister. She could hear her breath, shallow and rapid in her chest. Each step felt like it took an eternity. The attic was dark. She reached for the light switch, but stopped just before her fingers touched it. There was a sound, a rustling noise, like something moving in the dark. She could hear it breathing again. It wasn't human. The breath was too deep, too uneven. It came in rasping, ragged gasps, and it seemed to be getting closer. Emma froze, her heart thundering in her chest, and then a shadow darted across the room. She screamed and bolted back down the stairs, her feet slipping on the steps. She crashed to the floor at the bottom, pain shooting through her body, but she didn't care. She had to get out. She scrambled to her feet and grabbed her phone. She hit Mia's contact, her hands shaking too violently to type. Mia, I need you here. Please. The phone rang twice before Mia picked up. Emma? What's wrong? You sound terrified. I'm not alone, Emma gasped. "Something's here. Something's in my attic. Please. I need help." She heard Mia's voice crack with concern. "I'm coming over right now. I'll be there as fast as I can." Emma hung up and backed away from the stairs. The house felt suffocating, the walls closing in as she stood there, waiting. The minutes seemed to drag on, each one more agonizing than the last. She didn't dare go back up there. Then she heard it again, the soft rustling, the breathing. But this time it wasn't coming from the attic, it was coming from inside the house. Something was in the room with her, and it was moving closer. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was a quiet, almost unsettlingly silent night in the small, isolated cabin tucked deep in the woods. Far from the nearest town, this place was a refuge for people seeking peace, distance from the world, or a moment to be alone. For Alex, a city dweller exhausted by the demands of his work, this cabin was his escape, a break he desperately needed to recharge. He had been planning this trip for months, an entire week alone to unwind away from the noise, the phones, and the constant rush of everyday life. He was ready to embrace the solitude. By the time Alex arrived at the cabin, the sun had long dipped behind the horizon. The air was crisp, the scent of pine trees lingering heavily in the atmosphere. The cabin was old but charming, with a stone fireplace and wooden beams that creaked as the wind swirled outside. The key to the place was hidden under a rock, and the door creaked loudly as it opened, welcoming him to a world of stillness. Inside, Alex quickly settled in, starting a fire and unpacking his things. He enjoyed the quiet, the absence of interruptions. After a long day of driving, all he wanted was a hot meal and to crash in front of the fire. The night stretched on, and after finishing his dinner, he curled up on the couch, wrapping himself in a blanket and listening to the crackling of the fire. Hours passed, and the peacefulness of the cabin began to soothe his frazzled nerves. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Alex felt a sudden sense of calm, as though the weight of the world had lifted off his shoulders. But then, just as he was beginning to drift off, a noise broke through the stillness, an unmistakable sound that sent a chill down his spine. A thud, a soft, faint thud, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. Alex froze, his body stiffening as he strained his ears to listen. Another thud. It was louder this time. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the woods, though he couldn't be sure. Maybe it was just an animal, he told himself, or the wind shifting something in the trees. The rational part of his brain urged him to ignore it, but a sense of unease crept over him, whispering doubts into his mind. He tried to dismiss the thought, but the silence that followed the thuds made his skin crawl. Every nerve in his body seemed to be on alert. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees outside, but the sounds, they didn't feel like they belonged to the wind. The thuds had a rhythm to them, like something was moving, circling the cabin. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Alex decided to check the locks on the doors and windows just to be safe. He moved quietly through the cabin, flicking on the small light by the front door. The dim light seemed almost too weak against the vast darkness outside. The door was locked, as were the windows. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, as he was about to head back to the couch, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A faint silhouette, a figure, stood just beyond the window, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall and thin, like a shadow among shadows, but it was unmistakably there. Alex's heart raced, and he froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, staring into the cabin, unmoving, as though it was waiting for something. The tension in the air felt suffocating, and Alex could feel the cold sweat forming on his back. His mind raced through countless possibilities, none of them comforting. Maybe it was someone who had gotten lost in the woods, someone who had mistaken the cabin for a shelter. But that didn't explain why they weren't knocking on the door, asking for help. The figure didn't react, didn't blink. It simply stood there. After what felt like an eternity, Alex took a slow step backward, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. His hand hovered over the door's handle, his mind battling between the impulse to run and the rational need to keep himself safe. The figure remained motionless, and then, with a quick, almost imperceptible movement, it vanished. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He stood in the dark, staring at the spot where the figure had been, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. His mind raced with confusion. Was it a trick of the light? Was it just his mind overreacting to the isolation? He didn't want to find out. Alex grabbed his phone and tried to call the emergency number for the local sheriff, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. The cabin was deep in the woods, and the cell service was spotty at best. His anxiety deepened. He felt utterly alone. He checked the windows again, all of them tightly shut. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and suffocating. The fire in the fireplace crackled, its warmth doing nothing to ease the chill in his bones. Suddenly, there was a sound, this time coming from the back of the cabin, a scraping noise, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. Alex's heart pounded as the sound grew louder. It was coming closer, and he felt every muscle in his body tense in fear. He grabbed a small kitchen knife from the counter, his hand shaking. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he had no idea where to go. The cabin was surrounded by trees, miles from the nearest road. He was trapped. The scraping noise stopped, and a long pause followed. Alex's ears rang with the silence, each second stretching into an eternity. He tried to control his breathing, but it was shallow, erratic. His mind kept telling him to stay calm, to think clearly, but nothing could shake the dread that had settled deep in his gut. And then, from the back door, came the faintest sound of something tapping against the wood. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on the surface, slow and deliberate. Alex's breath caught again and he froze, his pulse hammering in his throat. Whoever or whatever was out there had found the back door. He moved quickly, silently, and crouched down behind the couch, the knife still gripped tightly in his hand. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, too loud, too fast. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside sent his nerves into overdrive. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made Alex's skin crawl. He wanted to look, to see what was out there, but the fear paralyzed him. What if it wasn't a person? What if it wasn't even human? The door's handle rattled softly, a low metallic sound that made his blood run cold. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. A sudden, sharp knock rang out, startling Alex so violently that he gasped aloud. But it wasn't the sound of knuckles against wood. It was heavier, like a fist, and it felt like a warning. A chill washed over him as a voice, low and raspy, whispered from the other side of the door. "I know you're in there." Alex couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His body trembled uncontrollably as the door handle rattled again. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. Who could this be? What did they want? Was it just some sick joke? Or had he unknowingly crossed someone's path in the woods? The voice came again, louder now, closer. "Let me in. You'll be safe if you let me in." The cold air from the outside seemed to seep into the room, chilling him to the bone. Alex couldn't speak. He couldn't move. The only thing that filled his mind was the terrifying certainty that the figure he had seen earlier, standing just beyond the window, was now at the door. The tapping returned, louder this time, and then a loud crash, like something heavy being thrown against the cabin walls. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, and he realized with a sickening clarity that whoever was outside wasn't going away. They wanted in. Panic surged through him. He could no longer stay hidden. The back door rattled again, and this time the handle turned, creaking as if someone was trying to force it open. The noise came from all sides now, scraping, tapping, scratching. His mind was screaming at him to get out, to run. But where would he go? The door burst open with a violent crash, splintering the wood. And there, standing in the threshold, was the figure. It was no longer just a shadow. It was something twisted, something wrong. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow all light. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over a gaunt frame, and its mouth hung open, revealing jagged teeth. And as it stepped forward into the cabin, Alex realized with dawning horror that he was not alone anymore. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was late October, and the air had taken on a chill that made the once vibrant colors of the leaves seem almost muted, as if the world itself was withdrawing into the long sleep of winter. For Amelia, the crisp, cool evening air was a relief. After the chaos of the past few months, she needed time to herself, time to decompress, reflect, and find some clarity. She had rented a small cabin in the mountains, far from the nearest town, surrounded by miles of thick forest. It was the perfect place for a quiet weekend, away from her hectic life. She had always been fond of the idea of solitude, and this cabin, tucked into the valley between the jagged mountain peaks, seemed like the ideal place to gather her thoughts. The first day of her trip was peaceful, almost dreamlike. Amelia spent the hours hiking the nearby trails, taking in the solitude and listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot. She marveled at the mountain air, so fresh and clean it felt like it was cleansing her from the inside out. That evening, she made a simple meal in the small kitchen of the cabin and curled up with a book by the fire. The warmth of the flames crackling in the hearth seemed to soften the sharp edges of her mind, and she let herself relax into the quiet. As the night grew darker, the wind began to pick up. It howled around the cabin, making the windows rattle with each gust. Amelia barely noticed at first. The storm outside added a certain drama to the night, but it didn't concern her. She wasn't afraid of storms. In fact, she found them calming. The more the wind howled, the more she felt herself sinking into the peace of the evening. She turned off the lights and let the fire provide the only source of illumination, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. It wasn't until much later, when she was just starting to drift off to sleep, that she heard the sound. It was faint at first, so faint that Amelia wondered if it was simply her mind playing tricks on her. But then it came again. A tap. A soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone knocking on the door, but it was too quiet for that. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the back of the cabin, from the woods behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. The wind had picked up and the trees outside were groaning in the storm. Surely, the noise she heard was just a branch brushing against the cabin, or maybe an animal scurrying along the outside wall. That had to be it. But even as she tried to reason with herself, the tapping came again. This time it was clearer, more distinct. 3 soft taps, followed by a pause, then another tap. Amelia's blood ran cold. She told herself she was being ridiculous. This was a remote cabin, deep in the mountains. She hadn't seen another soul since she arrived, and she hadn't heard a car or a person's voice for miles. It wasn't like anyone would come all the way out here in the middle of a storm, especially not in the dead of night. The idea of a visitor at this hour seemed absurd, and yet the tapping persisted. She pushed the blanket off and climbed out of bed, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping up her spine. Her feet were cold against the wooden floor as she tiptoed to the window, peeking out through the curtains. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling like a living thing, but there was no sign of movement outside. The darkness was absolute, and the rain had begun to fall in sheets, making it impossible to see anything beyond the few feet illuminated by the dim light of the cabin. The tapping came again, this time louder and more insistent. It was unmistakably coming from the back door, not from the window. Someone or something was definitely outside. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced. Should she check? Should she just ignore it and go back to bed? What if it was someone in trouble? What if it was a person who had gotten lost in the storm? She had read about hikers losing their way, only to find themselves on the wrong side of the mountain when night fell. But there was a nagging voice in her head telling her that something wasn't right. Her instinct told her that it wasn't a person out there. There was something about the rhythm of the tapping, something deliberate and calculated. It didn't sound like someone looking for help. It sounded like someone or something deliberately trying to get her attention. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, and the storm intensified. The tapping continued, but now it seemed to come from multiple places at once, as though someone was walking around the cabin, tapping on every window, every door. The sounds were now accompanied by an unsettling scraping noise, like fingernails running along the wood. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, and she backed away from the window, her legs trembling beneath her. Her mind raced for an explanation. Was it an animal? A bear or a raccoon, maybe? But the more she listened, the more she realized that whatever it wasn't acting like an animal. It was too purposeful, too steady. And then, just when she thought her heart might stop, the tapping stopped abruptly. She held her breath, waiting, listening to the wind and rain that seemed to fill the silence. The stillness was almost worse than the noise had been. It was too quiet, too empty. Amelia forced herself to move. She needed to check. She couldn't just sit there in fear. Slowly, she made her way to the back door. Her hand hovered over the doorknob for a long moment, her mind screaming at her to turn around, to run, to leave this place. But curiosity won out, and she turned the handle. The door opened with a loud creak, revealing the storm raging outside. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. The back porch was empty. No footprints, no signs of movement. Just the storm. Her breath came out in a sigh of relief. It was just her imagination. Maybe it had been the wind, or perhaps the tapping was a trick of the rain, the way it dripped and tapped against the walls. She stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin, and looked around. There was nothing. No one. She was about to turn back inside when something caught her eye. A shape, half hidden in the darkness at the edge of the porch, was barely visible. It was crouching, low to the ground, and even though she couldn't make out details, there was something horribly wrong about it. It was not an animal. Not a person, either. Amelia froze, unable to move, her heart slamming against her ribs. She couldn't tell what it was, but she could feel the dread welling up in her throat, choking her. The shape was moving closer, dragging itself slowly toward her, its limbs making sickening, unnatural sounds with each step. The wind howled louder, the rain pounded against the cabin's walls, and then, before she could even react, the shape lunged toward her. Amelia slammed the door shut just in time, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She locked it, backed away from it, and then ran toward the front of the cabin. She grabbed her phone from the counter and tried to dial for help, but there was no signal, nothing. She was alone, cut off from the world. The realization hit her with a sickening force. She had no way to call for help, no way to warn anyone. The storm outside roared, but it was nothing compared to the silence that followed in the cabin. Her ears rang with the absence of sound, the absence of normality. Amelia couldn't explain what had happened. The shape she had seen, the thing that had been hiding in the darkness, it didn't belong in this world. It had been like something out of a nightmare. She backed away from the door, trying to calm her breathing. Her head spun as she looked around the cabin. The quiet had returned, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that felt suffocating. The kind that whispered that something was still out there, watching. The tapping returned louder than ever, this time coming from the front of the cabin. Amelia's heart sank. It wasn't over. It would never be over. She moved toward the back of the cabin, checking the windows, the door, but it was no use. The thing from the dark was still out there. She had no way to escape, and she realized with horrifying clarity that the thing was already inside her mind. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I had always considered myself fairly independent. I lived alone in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. My job at the hospital had odd hours, so I was used to the stillness of the apartment at night, when the world outside seemed to slow down, and the only sound was the distant hum of passing cars. One night, after an especially grueling shift in the emergency room, I returned to my apartment around 2 a.m. I was exhausted, my feet aching, and all I wanted was to collapse into bed and sleep for a few hours before my next shift. The apartment was as silent as usual when I entered. I didn't even bother to turn on the lights. The faint glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. The place wasn't much, just a modest one-bedroom with a small kitchen and an even smaller bathroom, but it was mine. It felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the hospital. But tonight, for some reason, the silence felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I tossed my keys onto the counter and made my way to the bedroom. As I passed the living room, I couldn't help but notice the odd feeling that seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't anything specific, just a general unease, like something was off. I brushed it off, though. It was probably just the fatigue. I stripped off my scrubs and collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in the pillow. The cool sheets felt good against my skin, and within minutes, I could feel myself drifting off. The peacefulness didn't last long. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a strange noise. At first, I couldn't place it, some kind of faint tapping, almost like a distant knock at the door. I sat up, straining to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, or maybe a car door slamming outside. But then the noise came again. A tap, tap, tap. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 3:15 a.m. My heart rate picked up a little as I realized the tapping was coming from the direction of the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone at this time of night. In fact, I never had visitors late at night. I felt a chill run through me as I sat up in bed, my eyes fixed on the door to the living room. The apartment was small, and the living room and bedroom were separated by a short hallway. The idea that someone could be standing on the other side of that door, tapping, made my stomach turn. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The tapping continued. It was soft at first, but now it was getting louder. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind again, or maybe some strange noise from the building. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was as if someone was at the door, tapping with purpose, waiting for a response. My mind raced. Who would be here at this hour? I couldn't think of anyone. I wasn't expecting a delivery or any kind of visit. A sense of dread began to settle over me as I stared at the door. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it, and quickly dialed my best friend, Claire. She picked up almost immediately. "Hey, you okay? It's late," I whispered into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think someone's at my door. There's tapping. It's really weird." Claire's voice immediately grew concerned. "What do you mean? Are you sure it's not just the wind or something?" "I don't know. It's not like any noise I've heard before. It's coming from the door, and it's..." I hesitated, swallowing hard. "It's like someone's waiting for me to answer." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Claire's voice came back, softer now, more cautious. "I'm going to stay on the phone with you. Don't open the door, okay? Just stay quiet. I'll call the police." Before I could respond, the tapping stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my body. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to return, but nothing came. Minutes passed. Nothing. I couldn't tell if the person had left or if they were still there, waiting for me to make a move. "Claire?" I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the pounding of my heart. "I don't hear anything anymore. Maybe it's gone." Claire didn't respond immediately, and when she finally spoke, her voice was filled with hesitation. "You didn't hear anything else? No other noises?" "No," I said, "but it was so strange. I don't know. Maybe I was just imagining it. I feel crazy." She sighed. "Just lock your doors, okay? I'll call you tomorrow. If anything else happens, let me know immediately." I agreed, still feeling unsettled, but I didn't want to keep her up any longer. After hanging up, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. I stood up from the bed, moving cautiously toward the door. My mind was still racing. There was no way I could go back to sleep now, not after that. I checked the locks on the door and windows, making sure everything was secure. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me in the dark. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every noise, every little creak or pop in the walls made me tense. I finally managed to drift off, but it wasn't peaceful. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the tapping sound, wondering what it meant, who had been standing at my door, and why they hadn't just knocked or rung the bell like a normal person. Around 5 a.m., I was startled awake again, this time by the sound of a loud thud from the living room. My body jolted upright, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone, ready to call Claire again, but before I could dial, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from the hallway. I couldn't move. The footsteps were getting closer. I didn't know what to do. My mind was in a panic, and I couldn't think clearly. I grabbed the nearest thing, a lamp, and held it in front of me as a makeshift weapon. But as I watched the door, expecting someone to burst through at any moment, the footsteps suddenly stopped. I held my breath. The door to the living room creaked open. My body went cold. I couldn't move. There, standing in the doorway, was a shadow. It was tall, its outline barely visible against the faint light coming from the window. It didn't move, just stood there, like it was waiting for something. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. My heart was pounding in my chest as I ran to the door, locking it quickly. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Had someone broken in? Or had I been imagining it all? I had no way of knowing for sure, but one thing was clear. Whoever or whatever had been in my apartment was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed wide awake, watching the door, the windows, my phone at my side. The tapping had never returned, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of my mind. The next day, when the sun finally came up, I made a police report. They came and checked the apartment, but there were no signs of forced entry. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing out of the ordinary, but I knew what had happened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in my apartment, it was still out there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't done with me yet.
Story number 9.
I had always been the type of person who loved solitude, even in the middle of nowhere. My life was always busy, filled with work, friends, and the constant noise of the city. So when the opportunity came up for a weekend getaway in a remote cabin in the woods, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was small and rustic, located deep within a national park, hours away from the nearest town. The promise of peace and quiet, combined with the stunning views of the forest, was exactly what I needed. The journey to the cabin was long, but beautiful. The road twisted and turned through towering pines and rugged terrain, and soon the air grew crisp, fresh, and tinged with the scent of wood and earth. I finally arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The cabin was small, built of timber, and sat nestled in a clearing surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It was the perfect setting, the kind of place where nothing could go wrong. I had no reason to suspect that this trip would turn out anything but peaceful. After unpacking and settling in, I lit the fireplace to warm the cabin against the cold evening air. The fire crackled as I cooked a simple dinner, feeling the stress of the past few months melt away. Once I finished eating, I curled up in front of the fire with a book, letting the warmth wash over me. It was the perfect evening, still and quiet, save for the occasional sound of a branch snapping in the wind outside. I had planned to enjoy the night, taking it easy and relishing the peace. But the more I sat there, the more I realized how utterly alone I was. The silence in the cabin was absolute, the kind of silence that presses against your ears when there's no background noise to distract you. At first, I found it soothing, but as the night deepened, I began to feel the weight of it. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees and causing the windows to rattle. I glanced out the window, where the shadows of the trees danced in the dim light. The wind seemed to shake the trees harder now, and the whole cabin creaked with every gust. The storm had come quickly, and now, as the rain began to fall, it sounded like a constant, heavy drumming on the roof. I tried to ignore it, turning my attention back to my book, but something kept nagging at me, an odd sense of being watched, as though something was lurking just outside the window, waiting. I shook it off, blaming my nerves on the isolation. I had to admit, being alone in the middle of the woods, especially at night, made me feel vulnerable in ways I hadn't expected. Then, just as I was about to close the book and head to bed, I heard it. A soft knock. The faintest tap, tap, tap coming from the window. It was so quiet at first that I wasn't sure if I had actually heard anything at all. I froze, listening closely. Tap, tap, tap. There it was again. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Who could be out there in the storm? I hadn't seen another person since I left the main road, and there was no way anyone could get to this cabin in the dark, let alone in such a downpour. The thought of an unexpected visitor made my heart race. But I tried to calm myself. It was probably an animal, I reasoned. Maybe a raccoon or a deer. The thought of going outside to check filled me with dread, but my curiosity got the better of me. I approached the window, my feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Slowly I pulled back the curtain, my heart pounding in my chest. At first I saw nothing, just the blurry rain-splattered darkness of the woods. But then, just at the edge of my vision, I saw something. A figure, standing just outside the window. I gasped, pulling back the curtain in shock, but when I looked again, it was gone. Just like that, vanished into the night. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no way someone could have moved that quickly. It had been right there. A shadow, barely distinguishable against the darkness of the woods, but it had been there. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a trick of the light. The storm had made everything seem unnaturally dark and murky, or maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me after spending so much time alone in the woods. But then came the knock again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. My heart was pounding now, and every instinct screamed at me to hide, to lock the doors and windows and just wait until the storm passed. But I couldn't bring myself to leave the window. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness outside. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was just the wind, the trees, or something else harmless. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The knock came again, sharper this time, almost demanding. And then the sound of scratching, like nails dragging along the wood of the window. My blood ran cold. Whatever was outside was no animal. No wind or tree could make that kind of sound. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like lead, and my mind spun in a frantic frenzy. Should I call someone? But who would I call? There was no phone signal here. I was isolated, cut off from the world. I was alone. A sudden crash broke the silence, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping across the porch. The door. Someone was trying to break in. I rushed to the front door, locked and bolted from the inside, and placed all the furniture I could find in front of it. But even as I did, I could hear it, footsteps, soft and slow, moving around the cabin. Not on the porch, but just outside the walls, as though something was walking around the house, scraping along the sides of it, stopping occasionally to listen. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I grabbed my phone again, but there was still no signal. My hands were trembling, and a cold sweat had broken out on my skin. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself that it was just some animal, maybe a bear or a wildcat. But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, something inside me knew that wasn't the case. The scratching continued, and I heard a soft voice, barely a whisper, coming from just outside the window. "I know you're in there." I froze, blood running cold in my veins. I didn't know how to respond. My body felt like it was encased in ice, my throat too tight to scream. I stayed still, listening, hoping that the voice would go away. But it didn't. It stayed, like a presence just beyond the reach of the glass. "I know you're in there," the voice repeated, louder this time. "Let me in." I backed away from the window, my mind racing for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The door was blocked, the windows shut tight, and still the scratching continued. The voice, too. It wasn't a human voice. It was wrong, unnatural, like something that shouldn't exist in this world. Then the silence returned. Suddenly, and without warning, everything went quiet. No scratching, no voice, no wind, just the eerie quiet of the storm. I waited for what felt like hours, not daring to move, barely breathing. My eyes were glued to the door, the windows, expecting something to burst through at any moment. But nothing happened. Finally, I mustered the courage to move. Slowly, I approached the window again, but this time I didn't pull back the curtain. I only peeked through the edges, my heart thudding in my chest. There, in the distance beyond the porch, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of the light. It was tall, gaunt, with an unnatural, jerking motion as it turned its head to look at me. I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the window and bolted upstairs to the small bedroom, locking the door behind me. I crawled under the bed, huddling into a ball, praying that whatever was out there wouldn't find me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I could hear the footsteps circling the cabin, the scratching against the wood, the whispers that would come and go like a distant nightmare. But nothing ever happened. No one ever came inside. The next morning, the storm was gone, leaving behind a cold, foggy morning. The world outside looked peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had been out there, and it wasn't going away. I stayed in that cabin for another 2 days, too afraid to leave, too afraid to even open the door. When I finally did leave, there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no footprints, no trace of anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the whole time. I never returned to that cabin. I never went back to the woods. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind picks up and the shadows stretch long across the walls, I can still hear the tapping, storied.
Story number 10.
It was one of those late nights when everything feels off, like the universe is trying to tell you something, but you can't quite put your finger on it. I had been working long hours at a local diner, a place that didn't get much business after dark, so I was used to long, quiet shifts. But on this particular evening, something was different. It wasn't just the stillness of the night or the feeling that someone was watching me. There was an unmistakable heaviness in the air, and the hairs on the back of my neck kept rising for no apparent reason. The diner was in a sleepy part of town, with empty streets lined with dim streetlights that barely cut through the dark. My shift had ended around 11 p.m., and I had only a short walk back to my apartment. Usually I didn't mind the solitude, but tonight the silence felt like it was swallowing me whole. The only noise that broke through the silence was the occasional rattle of my shoes on the pavement and the soft whoosh of a distant car passing by. I was about halfway home when I noticed the faint sound of footsteps behind me. It was quiet at first, like someone walking at a leisurely pace, but it quickly picked up. I could feel the hairs on my neck stand up and my stomach twisted into a knot. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street behind me was empty. Still, the sound persisted. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to match my own. I tried to brush it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired, I hadn't eaten much, and I was probably just being paranoid. But the footsteps didn't stop. I started to walk faster, hoping that if I quickened my pace, I could get away from the unease that was creeping up my spine. But the footsteps only grew louder, faster. It was as if the person behind me was matching my speed, deliberately staying just far enough away that I couldn't catch a glimpse of them. My breath quickened, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced around, trying to spot any sign of life on the street, but it was as empty as before. No cars, no lights, just the sound of my own footsteps and those that seemed to follow. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned sharply down an alley, hoping to lose whoever, or whatever, was following me. The alley was dark and narrow, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp at the far end. I rushed forward, my pulse racing, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck, even in the cool night air. But as I reached the end of the alley, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were right behind me, so close that I could almost feel the presence of whoever was following. I spun around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the alley was still empty. I was alone. I took a few steps back, my eyes scanning the shadows, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was none. The footsteps had stopped, but the unease in my chest only grew stronger. I turned to leave the alley, but as I did, I saw something that froze me in place. At the mouth of the alley, standing in the darkness, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't just some passerby. The figure was standing perfectly still, facing me, as though it was waiting for me. I was paralyzed with fear. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible, but my body refused to move. It was as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to watch. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, a silhouette in the dark, watching me. I don't know how long we stood like that, me staring at the figure and it staring back at me. But eventually, I snapped out of my trance. I turned on my heels and ran, my heart racing as I sprinted down the street, away from the alley, away from that figure. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment building, my breath ragged and my body trembling. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I didn't care if the neighbors heard. I just needed to feel safe, to know that whatever had been following me was no longer close. But even as I tried to calm myself, the image of that figure lingered in my mind. Who was it? What did it want? Why hadn't it moved? I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch, my phone clutched tightly in my hands, my eyes glued to the door. I didn't sleep at all. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream, a figment of my imagination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But as I walked back to work, the sense of unease was still there. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me again. It felt like the shadows were darker than usual, the streetlights more distant, as if the world had shifted somehow, and I was no longer safe. As I passed the alley where I'd seen the figure, I hesitated. I glanced down it, half expecting to see the same silhouette standing at the end, waiting for me. But the alley was empty. The street was quiet. Nothing was out of place. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that everything was fine, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Something had happened last night, and I couldn't explain it. I went to work, but the feeling never left me. Every time I turned a corner or walked down an empty street, I felt like someone was watching me from the shadows. I started to dread the walk home, the trip that had once felt so familiar, so comforting, now filled with dread. The following week, I decided to take a different route home. I couldn't bear the thought of walking past that alley again, but as I rounded the corner of a different street, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure. Standing in the shadows. I froze, my heart pounding. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but I couldn't help myself. I slowly turned my head and saw the same figure, only this time it was much closer. It was standing just a few feet away, hidden in the darkness, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I felt my stomach drop, and for the second time, I found myself unable to move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed by the fear that had gripped me. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I could barely breathe. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was that person? Why were they following me? I never saw the figure again after that night, but the fear never really left me. Every time I walked home after dark, I could feel the weight of eyes on me, like I was being watched from the shadows, like the figure was still out there, waiting for me to slip up, to be vulnerable. I moved away from that town a few months later, hoping that the change of scenery would help me forget, that it would let me leave the fear behind. But I'll never forget the feeling of being followed, of knowing that something was out there in the dark, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
I had always loved the idea of getting away from everything, escaping the noise and chaos of daily life, especially the city. When I was invited to spend the weekend at a remote cabin in the woods, I didn't hesitate. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to unwind, enjoy some peace, and reflect on my life. The cabin was located miles from the nearest town, nestled deep in a forested area that was known for its isolation and tranquility. I wasn't worried. I was used to being alone and often sought out solitude, whether it was hiking or spending long weekends alone in quiet places. The drive there had been longer than expected, but the scenery was breathtaking. Towering trees, vast stretches of green, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife made the whole trip feel like a retreat. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the woods. The place was everything I had hoped for. Small, cozy, and surrounded by nothing but the forest. I was already looking forward to the next few days of seclusion. I unloaded my car, making a few trips to bring in my bags and supplies. The cabin was rustic, with a wood-burning stove and a fireplace in the living room. There was no TV, no internet, and no cell service. It felt like stepping back in time. I wasn't bothered by the lack of modern amenities. In fact, it was refreshing. As the night fell, I cooked a simple dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and lit a fire in the hearth. The flickering flames, combined with the warm glow of the room, made everything feel perfect. I was used to being alone, but there was something uniquely comforting about this moment. The silence of the woods outside, the crackling fire, and the soft hum of the wind in the trees. After dinner, I settled in with a book. The night was deepening, and the wind outside had picked up. It wasn't quite a storm, but the gusts made the trees sway, and the occasional creak of the wood could be heard from inside the cabin. The sound of the wind was both calming and eerie at the same time. I didn't think much of it. I had grown accustomed to the noises that came with being alone in the woods. But then, around midnight, something changed. I had just started to doze off when I heard a faint noise outside. It wasn't the wind or the trees. It was a soft, thudding cack like something or someone was moving around near the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped as quickly as it started, but the silence that followed felt oppressive, like the air was thick with something. I convinced myself it was probably just an animal. A raccoon, maybe? Or a deer moving through the brush. I had heard that kind of noise before, even in the most isolated places. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to push it out of my mind and went back to reading, but the quiet seemed to grow heavier as the minutes dragged on. And then came the knock. It was a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the front door. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting anyone. There was no one around for miles, and I had made sure the cabin was locked when I arrived. I sat frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The knock came again, 3 short taps, followed by a pause, and then another 3. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was someone who had gotten lost in the storm, but then I remembered there was no one else out here. I had seen no one during my drive, and no one knew I was staying at this cabin. No one had come by to check in. It was just me in the middle of nowhere. I slowly stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked quietly to the door and peeked through the small crack in the curtains, but there was nothing. The porch was empty, the only movement coming from the wind rustling the trees. I waited for a moment, my breath coming in shallow bursts, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the dirt. No trace of movement. I must have imagined it, I told myself. I turned to go back to the fire, trying to calm my racing heart, but just as I reached the hearth, I heard it again. This time, the knocking was louder, much louder. It was coming from the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking, soft at first, grew more insistent, like someone or something was trying to get inside. I rushed to the window, heart hammering, and peered through the glass, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I couldn't see anything clearly. The rain had started to fall heavily now, splattering against the window in sheets. But in the distance, through the blur of water and darkness, I thought I saw movement. A figure. Someone standing at the edge of the porch, just out of the light's reach. My blood ran cold. There was no one supposed to be out there. No one. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, hunched, and appeared to be standing completely still. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the figure moved away before I could make out any details. My body screamed at me to do something. Lock the door, barricade myself inside, call for help. But I had no phone service. There was no way to call anyone. I was isolated, alone, and the thought of going outside to confront whatever was out there terrified me. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I searched the cabin for something, anything, to help me feel safe. I grabbed a flashlight and a large kitchen knife, just in case. It felt silly, but it was the only thing I could do. I locked the door and double-checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. But then the knocking came again. It wasn't from the window this time, it was from the back door. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more taps. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Someone or something was playing with me. I knew it. The wind had stopped, and now the only sound was the dull thudding of the knocks against the cabin. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stood there listening. The knocks stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a voice. "Let me in." It was a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. A voice coming from outside. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering so loudly in my chest that I could hear nothing else. Who was out there? Why were they trying to get in? I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My throat was dry, my limbs stiff. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, but none of them made sense. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there. Slowly, I crept toward the back door, hoping to find a way to look outside without being seen. But just as I reached the door, I heard it again. "Let me in." It was closer this time. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing behind me. The cabin was still, the fire crackling in the corner, but the feeling of being watched, the sense of something lurking just beyond the door, was suffocating. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. I couldn't stay in that cabin another minute. I had to leave. I had to get out. I grabbed my car keys, quickly packed a bag, and ran outside, not even stopping to check the surroundings. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I didn't care about anything except getting as far away from that cabin as possible. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the tires crunching over the gravel as I sped down the winding road, not daring to look back. As I drove, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it been a person? Some kind of prank? Or was there something more to it? I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. But one thing was for sure. I would never go back to that cabin. Never. The next day, I contacted the park rangers, telling them about the strange occurrences, but when they checked the cabin, there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no evidence of anything unusual. Just the cabin, sitting empty in the woods. They told me it was probably just an animal, that I had been overreacting. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. Something was out there, something that wanted me to stay. And I was sure it was still there, waiting. Story the end.